Well, I've been working on getting a referendum and then getting a good result for the referendum for about 6 years. I'm an optimist. I never thought that the result was actually going to go against us. And certainly in the latter stages of the campaign, it became increasingly clear that the momentum was swinging behind the Vote Leave effort, and also that there were surprising things going on in terms of the way that we were reacting, even in the streets in the city, to some of the things which we were putting out. So the answer, I think, is yes. I really did believe we'd win, and although I thought that it might have been closer, but it wasn't that close, actually. Well, I voted in 1975, and I voted to stay in the European Union, the EEC as it then was. I think what I had in mind was a common market, a sort of free trade area, customs union, and I thought there were all sorts of good things about greater European unity. We'd been through 2 world wars, there was a Russian threat, Britain was down and out. I think things did change pretty radically over the following 40 years for me. I think the particular moment was when we were forced to decide not to go into the euro. Now, I think that was important because even if there hadn't been a referendum last year, I do believe that we would have been forced to make another decision about the euro in due course, and that would have actually meant that we would have been propelled out of the EU at that time. Well, it's been a major part of my life these last 6 years, and particularly recently, and of course it continues because we're still trying to support the quality of the negotiations. I was very lucky in a way because I have 2 daughters, both of whom had a vote, and both of them, for different reasons, were, without any pressure from me, actually leavers. Now, I know that goes against the generally accepted trend for young people, but it was the case. And in fact, I don't think I've lost any friends as a result of this. I found that, unlike some, I must say, that on the whole, our discussions have been good-natured and have been based on fact without too much acrimony. And one would like to think that that could go on. I think one of the difficulties, of course, is that the whole vote in the way that it went did surprise a lot of people. And I think it took a while for people to recover from that. But it's interesting, actually, that in the city, I think it became easier to talk to ex-Remainers because the city is very much about the future, about making decisions about the future. That's the nature of financial services. And everybody said, right, well, the job's done. So now we need to face together in the same direction. Well, the negotiations are massively complex, and the Irish issue is just one. I certainly think it's resolvable because there's such a massive export potential for Ireland, Southern Ireland, with the rest of the UK. And I think there are ways in which the issue can be solved. The difficulty, of course, is that there are underlying political issues in relation to the Northern Ireland minority who would be in favour of bringing the 2 countries together. And I think it's unfortunate that this is being used in blackmail terms at the moment, as it is as I speak to you. But I do think it's resolvable. In answer to your question as a whole, no, that wasn't specifically discussed or considered because it was always felt to be something which would be resolved, along with a great many other more detailed issues in the negotiations. And of course, so it's proving. Well, I think it's a very reasonable concern to say the government, until quite recently, has really not been addressing the city issue in a full way, because the main messages that they've been getting are from a very limited number of major multinational banks, most of whom are foreign-owned, frankly, and the city corporation, which rather unusually made the political decision to vote in favour of Remain in the run-up to the referendum. So the answer to that is that one of the things that we've tried to do in the Financial Services Negotiation Forum, the neutral body which we formed just after the referendum, was to make sure that we represented what you might call the underrepresented. And those are not only SMEs, the businesses, the innovative entrepreneurial businesses which are going to set the pace for the city's future, but also those people who were restricted, particularly those working for those major multinationals, who were actually capped. They were not allowed to speak. And that was very unfortunate because many of them had firm views which supported us. The result was that the city was portrayed as being overwhelmingly Remain, whereas in fact I think the situation is much more balanced. And what we're finding in our discussions is that the amount of the city business which is actually affected by Brexit, regardless of the outcome of the negotiations, is relatively small. Probably only about 10% of the revenues is at risk. And that is, of course, a revelation, because you wouldn't believe that if you heard the media pronouncements being made by the big banks, which, as I say, are mostly, and Goldman is an obvious example, not British-owned. To me, the whole issue of Brexit is a constitutional sovereignty matter. And it's a historic matter, too. I certainly regard myself as a European, and it may be that 200 years from now there will be a more united federal Europe. I think one of the problems has been that this whole issue has been rushed. The euro was brought in before the political structure was there. But the reason why I really became convinced that I wanted Britain to leave the EU was because we have a constitutional system in Britain which has a balance between the legislative, the judicature, and the executive, and overlaps too, which has evolved over 1,000 years. It's flexible, it works, people understand it, it's democratic, it provides accountability. What has emerged on the other side of the channel is something which is executive driven, where decisions are, and legislation, for instance, and directives are put forward by the European Council, which is in effect an executive body. And the European Parliament is the last person to approve them. This is not the case in Britain. There's also a situation where Britain, a major entity, really doesn't have the voice it should. And of course the European Court of Justice, all political appointments, we only have one in 28. Many of those people had never had any experience as judges until they went on it. So there are all sorts of good reasons why the British way of doing things and British sovereignty is better than ceding all these things to an entity which is only emerging and is really only 40 or 50 years old and is particularly inflexible in its own ways. There's all sorts of provision for qualified majority voting and for unanimity and so on. And it's executive driven, which the British Constitution is not. I just feel that our future is much better decided by the British independently, with a jolly good trading relationship with the European Union. Hopefully that's what we will be negotiating, will be the outcome of these negotiations more than anything else. But I am a European, and I want to emphasize that. And I suppose you could ask very reasonably, do I have second thoughts? The answer is no, except in one respect, and that is, I really do think that the referendum campaign could have been better planned. As it was planned, it was, I think, a rather biased affair. The argument was limited, the time frame was limited, the amount that we could spend was limited. Now, this was not a Brexiteer decision. This was a Remainer decision, and of course it backfired. But I do think the issue of deciding these kind of things, which I think was the right thing to do, in a referendum, needs a lot more thought, and we need to learn some lessons from what occurred last year.